Welcome once again to the Global Challenge. 213, 216, right use of time, right use of mind. I'm Clarity Ross here to help facilitate the big boost. The big boost is the right use of affirmations, which is the right use of time, which is the right use of mind. It's not a learning situation. There's no teacher here, and there's no learner here, and there's no learning or teaching taking place. What's taking place is reminding ourselves. I'm just simply a facilitator to encourage you to, let's all remind ourselves of the truth. That is what is necessary. Truth is already true. All we need to do is remind ourselves of this fact and drop the whimsy that we've been engaged with, the extreme eccentricity we've been engaged with. We can gently set it down. So affirmations are the way to do that. In the previous video, we used the affirmations using all the positive stuff, spiritual teaching, spiritual teachers, etc., and said that even spiritual teachers can't teach the ego anything. Even God can't teach the ego anything, which is true. On this video, we're going to do the flip side. We're going to use all the negative stuff and remind ourselves that stuff also cannot teach the ego anything. For instance, we can say death can't teach the ego anything. Let's start out with a big one. Death can't teach the ego anything. Death doesn't need to be death. Instead of death, oneness is seen. Okay, we can use that. We can use the form of aging. Aging can't teach the ego anything. Aging doesn't need to be aging. Instead of aging, oneness is seen. Destruction. Destruction can't teach the ego anything. Destruction doesn't need to be destruction. Instead of destruction, oneness is seen. Plague. Plague can't teach the ego anything. Plague doesn't need to be plague. Instead of plague, oneness is seen. Famine. Famine can't teach the ego anything. Famine doesn't need to be famine. Instead of famine, oneness is seen. Terror can't teach the ego anything. Terror doesn't need to be terror. Instead of terror, oneness is seen. Suicide can't teach the ego anything. Suicide doesn't need to be suicide. Instead of suicide, oneness is seen. Depression can't teach the ego anything. Depression doesn't need to be depression. Instead of depression, oneness is seen. So we can use any form of severe negativity we want to. Mayhem. Mayhem can't teach the ego anything. Mayhem doesn't need to be mayhem. Instead of mayhem, oneness is seen. Chaos. Chaos can't teach the ego anything. Chaos doesn't need to be chaos. Instead of chaos, oneness is seen. So we can climb the ladder here too. We can use these specific forms of severe negativity and climb the ladder all the way up. So we can try that. We can say, I'll just see if I can come up with some of these, and you're going to do the same old drill here, where I'm going to say something, and let me see. Okay, and then your time to repeat it. So let's start off with like something very negative, like cancer. Okay. Cancer can't teach the ego anything. Repeat that. Oops, your turn to repeat it. Let's start again. Okay. Cancer can't teach the ego anything. Cancer doesn't need to be cancer. Instead of cancer, oneness is seen. Aging can't teach the ego anything. Aging can't teach the ego anything. Aging doesn't need to be aging. Instead of aging, oneness is seen. Death can't teach the ego anything. Death doesn't need to be death. Instead of death, oneness is seen. Destruction can't teach the ego anything. Destruction doesn't need to be destruction. Instead of destruction, oneness is seen. Famine can't teach the ego anything. Famine doesn't need to be famine. Instead of famine, oneness is seen. Plague can't teach the ego anything. Plague doesn't need to be plague. Instead of plague, oneness is seen. Disasters can't teach the ego anything. Disasters don't need to be disasters. Instead of disasters, oneness is seen. War can't teach the ego anything. War doesn't need to be war. Instead of war, oneness is seen. Mayhem. I say mayhem. Mayhem can't teach the ego anything. Mayhem doesn't need to be mayhem. Instead of mayhem, oneness is seen. Atrocities. Atrocities can't teach the ego anything. Atrocities don't need to be atrocities. Instead of atrocities, oneness is seen. Mental breakdown can't teach the ego anything. Mental breakdown doesn't need to be mental breakdown. Instead of mental breakdown, oneness is seen. Collapse can't teach the ego anything. Collapse doesn't need to be collapse. Instead of collapse, oneness is seen. Chaos can't teach the ego anything. Chaos doesn't need to be chaos. Instead of chaos, oneness is seen. All right, very great. We're just climbing the ladder there. And you absolutely can do that. You can take some time, any time actually, when something negative comes to your attention, to say, okay, let me put that into a ladder, and let me climb the ladder up, all the way up to chaos. Chaos is the ultimate attempt to teach the ego something, actually. It is the ultimate attempt. And from personal experience, I can say it doesn't teach the ego anything. It absolutely does not. So we can use all the different forms of devastation, destruction, all the way up to chaos, absolute chaos. And we can remind ourselves that none of these teach the ego anything. So it's important to remind yourself specifically, and then keep climbing the ladder to more and more intense forms, And so that's covering the very, very negative stuff in this video. Important to practice that, not to dwell on anything specifically or fixate on it. Say, I'm going to dwell on this one aspect. Okay, no. They say, I'm going to dwell on famine. I'm just going to say famine, 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 famine. No, because that prevents you from generalizing it to all forms of suffering, misery, destruction, etc. It's very important, and the whole purpose of these affirmations is to generalize it out, not excluding anything specific, not excluding anything general, from specific to general, without leaving anything out, not excluding anything. And we don't have to include everything in our practice of affirmations in order for the idea to generalize. It spreads out automatically that way, as it were, as long as we make sure we're not trying to exclude anything. All right? We don't have to name every sickness, in other words, because there's too many. But we can name some, and then we can climb the ladder and say, sickness can't teach the ego anything. Sickness doesn't need to be sickness. Instead of sickness, oneness is seen. All right. We'll keep these videos fairly short, and we'll see you on the next one. Very great.